baby doll a year ago. You told me I was very nice to know.
Well, we're here today with Ruth Wade, also known as B.K. Duncan. You're here to talk about your novel Foul Trade, set in 1920s London, which has, rather excitingly, been nominated for a People's Book Award. So tell me about Foul Trade.
Foul Trade is a historical crime novel set in 1920 in the East End Docklands district, so around Poplar and Limehouse, and it features a coroner's officer, May Keats, and it's her job to investigate unnatural killings and murders.
And 1920s, why that particular period?
1920s has always fascinated me. There's something about the contrast between the brashness, the sort of advertising ephemera, the Art Deco, the clothes, and juxtapose that against the tragedy of the times, that everybody was fighting to survive after the Great War, because everybody had lost someone, either to the war itself or to the influenza epidemic or malnutrition, poverty. There was so much that it echoes in a lot of ways the sorts of things that we go through now. The mass unemployment, political struggles, a lot of xenophobia and racism, and actually what is particularly topical, a lot of immigration, which didn't go down very well in the East End.
So was that another reason to write it, because you could reflect back, you could use it as a time to reflect back on now?
Absolutely. I think it was the director of the British Museum who said, if you think carefully about the past, you will be able to think differently about the present. And I believe that fundamentally about history, because history was people by real people. I think we forget that sometimes. We see it as facts, we see it as dates, we see it as wars, but it was real people exactly the same as us. So it's an area that I want to explore in my novels.
And you mentioned May Keats there, she's a central character in your novel. Tell me a little bit about May.
People often ask me, is May me? No, she's not. But May has my sensibilities, because I can research, I can use oral history, I can use diaries, all sorts of things for her setting. So the sorts of things she would do, the sorts of things she'd be interested in. But I have no research material other than who I am to call on for her emotions. So how she feels about things, how she reacts emotionally to something. So in that way, she very much is me. I wanted her to be a young woman, and I wanted her to be working class. I wanted her to be minimally educated for the time, but intelligent. So she goes to the library, she goes to night classes and things like that. So she's very streetwise. She's been brought up on the Dockland streets of Poplar, so she knows her way around. But I wanted her also in a situation where she's slightly uncomfortable. So she's in a man's role. She's not that confident with that. And over the whole course of the series, because this is the first in a series, she will grow into that role and discover some confidence about who she is.
Do you know where she's going then? Do you know the rest of her story?
Yes and no. I know certain bits. I know the things that are very personal to her. For example, why her father committed suicide. I know that she wants to be a success. I know that her own recklessness will get her into trouble. I don't know whether she's going to have a relationship with Jack, who's a reporter, who's her sort of sidekick for some of the investigations. I haven't worked that out yet.
Now, being a working class woman in the 1920s, not that easy. As you say, there were men prowling around expecting her to give up her job. She's living on the breadline. Why did you put her in that position?
Because I didn't want to do another Downton Abbey. I think there's a big issue for me about how we portray the past and how we portray the lives of people in the past. We sanitise things with nostalgia. Most people think about the 1920s and they think of flappers and country house parties and jazz and all having a good time. But it wasn't like that for a lot of people, for the vast majority of people. And so I wanted to write about someone who I would consider ordinary, who, if I had been born then, in that place, that time, who could have been me.
And you talk about that underbelly of society, it not being all flappers in the 20s. You certainly explore that. We go down to the docks, we see prostitution, we see poverty, we see opium dens. Parts of it are quite an uncomfortable read for the reader.
Good.
You like putting readers in that position?
I would like to think that readers think about certain aspects of my stories. I want them to be entertaining, obviously. I like to show the light and shade. Because another thing about the 20s and the flappers, and there was a lot of opium taking, there was a lot of cocaine, and I think that we tend to regard that now as if everybody was having a good time. If you think about it, they'd just come out of the Great War. There was tremendous social upheaval. There were terrific class barriers. There was a lot of unemployment. There was a lot of establishment squashing down of things. And a lot of people took drugs to escape the harsh reality of life. So it was pure escapism, not necessarily fun. And I think we forget that. There's a desperation in it. And that's one of the things I wanted to get across.
Well, that's another of the parallels with the present day, isn't it? That people are taking drugs to escape. And certainly if you go down to the Docklands today, those that haven't been refurbished with very glamorous flats, you might find some of those characters still there, I guess.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another of the parallels is the Tongs, which were the Chinese gangs who basically were protecting the only thing they had economically, which was the drugs racket. That's so similar to the inner city gangs now, protecting the drug racket. It's always gone on. We think that's a fairly modern phenomenon, but it isn't. I mean, in the First World War, the troops were sent heroin and morphine to help them relax in the trenches. Drug use was pretty rife.
And it's written in the third person. Did you ever think about writing it in May's voice in the first person?
No. I've written a lot of novels, my apprentice pieces. I have never written one in the first person. I teach creative writing, and when I talk to my students, I'll always say it's about the camera being on the shoulder. And what you can do in the third person is have the camera very close, listening in to the thoughts in the head. But if you stick to first person, you can only ever have the camera looking outwards. The other problem with first person is it has its limitations for stories, and this is a crime story, and I wanted mystery, and I wanted certain things going on that the reader will be aware of because we have other characters' point of view, but May won't be aware of. You can't do that in first person because the character can only know what they know, and they can't know what they don't know.
Well, let's talk about plotting then, because in the past you said you've always found character easier than plot. In a crime novel, generally plot is of more importance. How did you find it plotting through a crime novel?
Difficult. Very, very difficult. In a crime book, the plot has to be relentlessly going forward to bring all those other things in. So I worked very hard at getting a plot. I sent various iterations to my agent, who would come back and say, yes, nice detail, but where's the plot? And I think it's made me a better writer as a consequence with focusing on plot, but it will never be what drives me first and foremost. It's the people. I'm interested in the people. They may be people of my imagination, but they're still real people. So what I have to have is a plot that hangs together, that captures the reader, involves the reader, but not, in my view, at the expense of character. The character always comes first. But hopefully I've done it right with plot this time.
And you're having to think more about things like pacing and red herrings and clues and twists and turns.
Yes. The crime genre is forgiving but quite exacting. There are expectations. We all have expectations when we read, but the crime reading aficionados know their stuff, and they want to know that you're giving them what they expect but a little bit more.
And they're very exacting readers, so they will know if you said somebody was here at 7 p.m. on a Saturday and then later on in the book you have them elsewhere, they'll know.
They'll know.
There is also something in a novel, you can have all the facts there and all the characters. There is an atmosphere sometimes to a novel, and there is a very strong atmosphere in your novel. Were you aware of that when you're writing it? And how do you create an atmosphere? Sometimes it's just certain colours that are mentioned, certain areas that are explored, but there is this sort of dark side to what you write about.
I start with wanting to create a tone and an atmosphere, and the most important thing for me was an atmosphere of the streets, really. The fact that it was incredibly busy and incredibly noisy and incredibly smelly, that was really important. But what I've learned since from readers is that it is dark, that it feels quite grim, that some readers have said, which is a tremendous compliment for me as a writer, that when they've closed the book, they felt as though they had to wipe the soot off their clothes. I didn't intend it to be quite that hard-hitting about poverty, but I did want it to be true to the people of the time, to the oral history that I'd read, and if that's what it was like, then I'm extremely glad that's come across. But I didn't intend it to be quite so difficult. I think when I was writing it, I would see more of the light and shade, but I think sometimes maybe the backdrop of the harshness, the difficulty of life.
And of course the end of the First World War, very recent, that overhanging everything.
Absolutely everything. I mean, May, her backstory I gave her was that she was an ambulance driver in 1918 at the front. And there were a lot of young people who had that experience at a time that they were still learning to be themselves at a very, very formative period in their lives. So one of the things I wanted to get across for May was that was so close to death that she needed the excitement of danger forever after. So one of the things that she is, which I have to admit probably has got something to do with me, is she's slightly physically reckless. She will just go off and do things. And she was brought up on the Docklands streets. She knows her way around. She's used to pub fights and all sorts of things like that. But she was also an ambulance driver, and she had to pick up bits of shattered soldiers. She knows what death is like, and she also knows how to not distance herself from it, but protect herself emotionally from it. There's that fatalism, if a bullet's got your name on it. And in a lot of the research that I read, a lot of the poems from the Great War, a lot of the diaries, a lot of the memoirs, there was very much this thing of death is so close. It gave a melancholy to life, I think, and a fatalism.
But for women it did provide an opportunity for them to work. She's working in the coroner's office. Would many women have been in that role?
Unlikely. In my research, I could only find information on two real coroner's officers. One was the one in Poplar, who was the undertaker, and one was Coroner Oswald's coroner's officer, who was a policeman given light duties for his chest. So I assume that's consumption. But it wasn't a legally constituted position, so the coroner could appoint anybody, and the men weren't around. So when the book starts, the previous coroner's officer went over to France to fight and was forever buried under French soil. So she was clerk and then was promoted to coroner's officer, frankly, because there was nobody else and because the coroner was too lazy to go and find anybody else. So right from the kick-off of the story, she's in a position where she's got to prove herself. She's got to work harder than any man would have to in the job. She's got to make sure they don't all think that she's just a young girl who can't cope, who might have the vapours at any moment. It's not dissimilar to the situation that a lot of people face today, a lot of women face today in every society. You have to work that bit harder to overcome the stereotypes.
So tell me about your research, because you didn't make it easy for yourself. You set it in a particular time period, a particular place, and used a particular profession. So how much research did you do, and how did you go about doing the research to make it feel authentic?
I researched for months and months and months. I knew some of the things I didn't know, and then as I researched those, I found out all the things I thought I knew and then I didn't know. One of the difficulties was to remember that so much has changed. So, for example, I researched a lot about what pathology was known then. That was the most important thing, to get the time right. That I couldn't stray into what I know because I'm in the 21st century, and what they knew because they were in the 1920s. Things like the court system, which is very different to our court system, even though the names were the same. So there's the coroner's court and the magistrate's court and the police court, but they actually intersected and operated differently. There was obviously the daily life, things like where people shopped, opening hours for pubs, the number of people on a jury, which had changed after the Great War because so many men were at war that they couldn't have large juries. All sorts of things. I suppose place, people, the time. I also did a lot of research on a second strand within the book, which was music hall and theatre. So that was a thrill to be able to do that and to be able to use it, because every writer wants to be able to use their research. And the problem is most of us writers use too much of the research.
Well, I was going to say, you have to use it, but use it lightly. So how do you make sure that you use it lightly? You're not shoehorning in facts that you like, that you want to share with people, that it's not intrusive.
Okay. So first draft, more than likely put too much in. And then I rewrite and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. Hemingway said that what you have to do is write the whole iceberg. Take out most of it that's underwater and just leave the tip in there. So you take out so much of the research, and what you leave is the gap where the research was. You have the feeling of the research and the authority. And as a writer, I think you have the confidence, because I knew I put it in, therefore I have made it feel right. If I take it out, the feeling should still be there. That's what I hope.
And you did find a gift in Oscar Kirk, who the book is dedicated to, didn't you?
Indeed.
Tell me a little bit about Oscar.
I found Oscar Kirk's diary in London Museum Docklands in one of their collections, and at age 14 in 1918 he started as a messenger boy in East India docks and West India docks, and he kept a diary, and what they still have is the diary from 1919 when he was 15, and his entries are fabulous.
Most of it is just every day.
Oh yes, had shepherd's pie for tea, had cod, took Marjorie for a walk, listed the books that he'd got from the library, made chocolate with his nana, but boiled the fat and spoilt it. And what that gave me when I read that was the confidence to realise that ordinary people are ordinary people, whatever time they're in. What concerns them, what concerned the boy of 15 was exactly what would concern a boy of 15 now. What they eat, whether they can play football with their friends, was there anything exciting happening, did the police catch them when they were running around the docks, all sorts of things. So it's just that everyday ordinariness.
And that minutiae of life, I
Yes.
guess, what he is eating, what it's costing him to do various things that you can use.
One of the things about research is what can be very difficult to find out about is that very ordinary thing, because nobody bothered to talk about it. So it's not in any of the academic books, it's not necessarily in oral history either. So it took me ages to try and work out whether or not there were still horse-drawn cabs in the East End in 1920, or whether there would be electric lighting in houses and things like that. And it made me be able to imagine what it must have been like. And it is that minutiae that really makes the difference. And it's those sensual details that if you can put that in your writing, then what it can do is make the reader feel what it was like.
And it's lovely you dedicate the book to him. Do you know what happened to him?
He worked in the docks nearly all his life, I think, and he didn't stay a messenger boy for long. I think he was promoted to dockmaster, I think, and he died in 1980.
So you've written other works as Ruth Wade, but this one is written under the pseudonym B.K. Duncan. Why did you write under a pseudonym, and where did B.K. Duncan come from?
Pseudonym was for two reasons. One, so that readers are quite clear that if they pick up a B.K. Duncan book, it will be a crime series. It will be May Keep's crime series. Or if I start to write other series, they will still be under the name B.K. Duncan. Ruth Wade writes more psychological crime books, still set in the 1920s, but different in tone. My research is quite similar for both different sets of books. So if I see myself as B.K. Duncan and I write as B.K. Duncan, it's easier for me to get into that crime series writer mode.
And you have got your name out there. Tell us about the book awards.
I'm in the final. B.K. Duncan is in the final of the People's Book Prize. The award ceremony is on the 12th of July this year, and people can vote for it. So it's a truly democratic book prize. It's voted for by the public. And the polls are open until the 10th of July. Two things that interest me very much about the book prize. One is that the founding patron was Dame Beryl Bainbridge, who I've read all my life. And I'm actually up for the Beryl Bainbridge First Time Author Award, which I would be very proud. I'm proud and honoured to be nominated for it. I would be extremely proud to win it. But another thing that I'm particularly interested in is the book prize organisers, in their constitution, is to help eradicate illiteracy. And as a writer and a reader, I think that is incredibly important. So, being a finalist, I will become an ambassador to work in schools and prisons and the community to try and help eradicate illiteracy.
Well, good luck with that.
Thank
Yes,
you.
good luck with it. So what next for you?
Well, I'm just putting the finishing touches to the second book in the May Keep series, which is Found Drowned. One of my books as Ruth Wade is currently with publishers for consideration, and another book by Ruth Wade, A Fatal Rhythm, is out in Kindle. So more writing, more teaching writing, and more research.
Yes, you do teach writing. So we'll finish this by saying, if you had one piece of advice to give to writers who may be watching, what would that be?
Don't expect perfection, it doesn't exist. But work as hard as you can. What I find with most new writers, and I was the same myself, you're frightened of putting something down because it isn't right. Just put it down. The real craft of a writer comes in the rewriting. Every time you rewrite, you make it better and better and better and closer to the vision that was in your head in the first place. So just write it down, then work on it. And I think that's the key. But you can't be a writer if you don't write it down.
You made me think you loved me in return. Don't tell me you are fooling after all. For if you turn away, you'll be sorry someday. You left behind a broken